viewers this evening, first and foremost, Paul, are going to want to know how you initially came across Churchill's paintings and how that translated into the voyage of discovery that then followed for you.
I think it was 2004. I found a painting in, of all places, Los Angeles. It was in an antique bookshop. And I feel it was a watercolor, and it was signed Winston Churchill. And I wrote to David Coombs, who said it wasn't by Churchill because he never painted in watercolor. But it was nice to meet me, and he's such a lovely man. We corresponded, and it got me focused on Churchill's paintings. And from that point on, I was really aware of Churchill as the painter. And then going backwards and forwards with David, I recognized certain places like Notre Dame de Vie in Mougins, where I live. And we've had a long friendship. And then it developed into a book. It was much later on, because I kept finding places, either by chance of actually painting them. And a friend of mine suggested, why don't you do a book? Which I thought was a good idea. And I was going to do the whole world, which is daunting because there's so many paintings and so varied. And my wife suggested that I simplify it and just do the south of France, which was much a wiser idea. And then we're here today. And it's been a great, great trip. I've met so many wonderful people. Obviously, the Churchill family are wonderful, and the extended family of Chartwell and Churchill College. Everybody's been so kind. And it's fun. I've really enjoyed it. A little obsessed. My children think I'm obsessed. I'm really not. I just think you have to be focused to get to this point, to do it. So that's
absolutely. And I think, yeah, and such a good place to start as well, because I think more than any other country, France features in Churchill's paintings. And as an artist who lives in France, I'd be very interested to hear why you think those particular landscapes particularly inspired his paintbrush.
Well, if you count the physical number of paintings, he did about 150 approximately in France generally, most in the south of France. In Italy, he did almost the equivalent number. And in England, I think is about 115, 130. So he obviously, I think that was by holidays rather than just loving the landscape more than Britain or Italy. I think he was just here more on holiday. So he did a lot, and there were a lot more unknown locations here, or vague ones. And I think in defense of David, when he first came to archive everything, and Lady Churchill and possibly Lady Soames, that they weren't titled. So it was very hard to find some of these or remember, and maybe he would have even forgotten where some of them were. But there were a great number in France. And so you're right, it was a good place for me to start. But Italy and Britain also rank very high, whereas other places like Marrakesh or the pyramids and even America, there are much fewer paintings.
And I think as well, it's one of the things I love about your book is that there is this exploration of discovering the locations of the paintings. But in addition to that, you go into some of the wider practices, his materials, his mentors. Just thinking for a moment about, I'm going to say his materials first and foremost, you know, the oils he was using, the paintbrushes he was using, the easel he was using. How do you think those components fed into his output as an artist?
Well, I think the reason I focused on the paintings is I tried to do the materials is I wanted to do a book that I would buy. And I think a lot of either historians or academics tend to write books on purely that, the history and the paintings on their own. Whereas I was interested in the easel he used, for instance, is very unusual. Lavery, I think, introduced him to this handmade easel. And it's almost unique to him. It's enormous. It's like a Cadillac of an easel. So, all of these materials and how he made the paintings, because I think it shows how focused and how serious he was about his art. He wasn't one of these wealthy hobbyists. He genuinely, I think he really did it and almost could have done it for a living. I think, like his writing, he took it very seriously. As in politics or anything he did, I think he really focused on it. So the materials were very important to me. Maybe less so to other people. And I don't think I did too much on his materials. I was saying to David yesterday while we were talking, even the way he held the brush, I put a brush out so that I'd have it, but he would hold his hand on a right angle and the brush, so it was like this shape. And it's just something I noticed that not many people do. If I hold a brush, he held it to the end, which is a good way of holding it. A professional painter doesn't hold it at the ferrule, they hold it at the end. But he had very delicate hands, and there were things that I noticed that could border on obsession, but I just think they were important to the way he made the art and how he painted that other people, non-artists, wouldn't notice. So I don't think I went too far with that. I think it's enough.
I think it is genuinely a really interesting element, and it's great to hear you point things out, like the right angle of his hand, because I've seen hundreds of photographs of Churchill painting over my time at Chartwell, and you're right, it is a really distinct way of holding the brush.
Yeah.
You said about the sort of the focus and the dedication to the art, and there are some elements of him as an artist that are sort of constant throughout, but there is also this trying different things out, trying different techniques, continuously wanting to improve. How would you say that side of him, the sort of excitable, ever keen to learn, ever keen to develop, manifested in him as an artist?
Well, I think it was the one area that I think I wrote in the book. There were a few pieces, because if you read Churchill's the valet and the detectives books, and possibly the secretaries, you get a slightly different view of the man, because they were with him, and they were with him in the private moments. And Norman McGowan made a comment that he would be painting away and be grumbling, saying that's no good, and he would scrape off the paint. And he didn't like people looking over his shoulder, and made no moans about telling people that he didn't want that. So you start, but he said he was very modest, and but he was quietly proud of what he produced. And I think he took it very seriously, as you say. I think he really tried to learn from people, but he was not insecure about it, but he was like almost like a child, really genuinely trying to learn this. And you see it in some paintings where he copied other artists. He would be lent paintings by, for instance, Philip Sassoon. He copied Cézanne, the still life that Reeves owned. Sassoon lent him a Daubigny, I think, and a Sargent, and he would copy them to learn. The Sargents he did are wonderful, because he was, they were landscapes, and he did a fantastic job. Monet, he painted a lavery of the beach in Tangier with a figure on it. And I think he was really trying to learn. And your point about growing and being different, there are a couple of paintings. One came up at auction recently it's quite unusual for him. It was almost like a Fauve's painting. It was very bold and almost outlined. And you can see him experimenting and pushing himself. It almost doesn't look like a Churchill, whatever a Churchill looks like. And that's because he's learning and growing, and it wasn't his work. It wasn't how he earned money. I think he could take much more chances than, for instance, if he wrote things, I'm sure he would knock things out. For instance, the articles that he would write, that he would make money on, almost like a painter that would just do paintings to sell. He didn't have to do that for himself. He was purely doing it for himself. He didn't care. He wasn't trying to sell his paintings or his work. So I think that answers your question. How do you feel as a historian, when you look at the body of work in Chartwell, how do you feel overall? Can you recognize a Churchill?
I'd say so. I think that particularly in the context of Chartwell's wider collection of paintings that were owned by Sir Winston, the ones by him certainly do stand out. I think one of the things that is most obvious to me, particularly in his Impressionist style paintings, particularly his waterscapes, and I know we've spoken about this before, Paul, is the sense of sort of impasto, and the amount of paint that is going on the canvas differs hugely from anything else we have at Chartwell. So that element to me really stands out. And I think what you were saying about copying as well, at Chartwell there is the element that we have both sides of the coin across different elements of the collection. So for example, we have a painting by John Lewis Brown of two figures on horses, two cavalry officers, which hangs above the door to the study. And we know that Churchill painted that, but the Churchill copy, I confess I don't know off the top of my head where it is. I think it's probably in a private collection, but we have the original at Chartwell. Whereas on the other hand, we have a painting in the studio that is a copy of a painting by Monet, which is, as a result of the redisplay that I did last year, brought down to a much easier site level. It's just below Hoe Farm in the new hang. Yeah. So the copying is such an interesting element. And there's another one which It's called Two Glasses on the Veranda, which is in the sitting room at Chartwell. And I hadn't realised that was a copy until I went to the National Gallery, and they had the original painting, which is a sergeant. And I did a double take because it looked almost exactly like Churchill's. It's an incredibly good copy. And I think that actually, for me, that one is the most extraordinarily accurate a recreation of an original.
Yes.
And with some of them, there's the sense of he is trying to get under the skin of what the artist was doing, but not necessarily minding if he wasn't 100% accurate. But there were somewhere genuinely.
Yes, but do you see his hand in it? It's overall, he was an amateur painter, but do you see his hand in the painting rather than just seeing a sergeant? Yes,
I'd say so. I think you can tell. You can just see the energy in it. That's one thing I always think, the sort of energy and the enthusiasm, to me, sort of jumps out of the image. So I would say I can spot a Churchill, but then again, I spend a lot of my time looking at Churchills in my job. I've even got a couple of replicas behind me at home. So I rarely get away from Churchill as an artist.
But you see, but somebody that lives among them, somebody that's just visiting and passing makes a judgment on them, but somebody that lives among them, you do get a different sense. They're like almost like a family member or pet that you can recognize. And I think that's a good thing. As an artist, you want that. You want to be able to spot your work across the room. And I think that's a mark of a good painter. If I would say that his work really relied on any technique, it would probably be Impressionism. Of all the paintings that he did, I think that he was influenced by not so much the Cézanne, the very square brush strokes, but he loved him, but more the Monet, broken strokes. I think that's, if I were to sum up his paintings, but within that, he definitely veered off and tried to grow. At the very beginning, we were speaking of the Portraiture, and I'd be interested in, because I was looking yesterday at the Portraiture. The early work is much darker when he was painting with Lavery at the beginning, and learning in the studio, especially in the portraits. They were very dark, and I don't think it was necessarily the mood he was in. It was just where he was learning and under Lavery's tutelage. But the Portraiture, I counted around 16 known paintings, and then another 16 of figures that you could recognize within a landscape. They're quite different, where it's a formal portrait. And I think that the one he did of Lavery in the studio is quite finished. It's one of the most finished portraits that he did, and apart from the one he did of himself, the self-portrait. But how do you feel about his portraiture compared to his landscape?
Very different. They're by and large a lot more naive, I would say. If anyone knows the art historian Simon Sharma, he once did some filming at Chartwell, and he and I got chatting. And he said that he thought Churchill's portraits were far superior to his landscapes. And I remember being slightly taken aback by that, because that's not a very commonly voiced opinion. And I think with his portraits, one thing that's really interesting is how many appear unfinished. Yes. I think more than half of them look like they've just sort of been abandoned halfway through. Yes. Paul, why do you think that would have been, that they would have just been left seemingly unfinished?
I think, as a landscape painter myself, I think portraiture is one of the most difficult things to do. And I think either he felt it was not successful. He loved to go back to his paintings. I think he'd have them in the studio and he would work on them, even completely radically changing them. And I wonder if he felt they were not successful, because he would overwork things. And it was the one thing that Lady Churchill always tried to do, is get a painting off the easel before he ruined it, that she would think he ruined it. I can only imagine that he felt like he wasn't adding any more, it didn't interest him anymore. Or maybe he did them from life, I don't know. I know a lot he did from photographs, but I don't know. I genuinely don't know why, I don't know. But I am interested to see his portraiture. I think his still lives are much more successful, as are his landscapes. So I beg to differ with, I think he was very successful, especially in some of his still lives. I think some of those are the most competent and well executed paintings, personally. One thing I read, I was looking again at some of the comments that I'd made, and I really did try to look at the comments I make for the book that relate to Churchill as a painter. And Lady Lytton's comment about, she said, when you first meet Churchill, you see all his faults, and then you spend the rest of your life seeing all his virtues. I think that a little bit about his paintings. I think it's very easy to immediately look at his paintings, go into the studio of Chartwell and have an opinion. especially with these incredible prices at auction being achieved. So it's much more under the spotlight. He's being much more criticized, or the critique around his work. But I do think the more you look at his work and how he achieved it and what he meant by it, meaning that it was a hobby, he didn't set out to exhibit, I think that I have a different respect for his paintings. I didn't dislike them when I first came to them, but I definitely see them different. And anybody that criticizes them just off the top, I would challenge them to set up an easel. And the canvas that he painted was enormous. They weren't, if I paint plein air, I paint a reasonable size. Within an hour and a half, the light changes so rapidly. And he would set up a huge canvas and he would paint very fast and cover it. Within about 2 hours, he was covered the canvas. And it's really bold of him, of what he would do. And I would challenge anybody to set up a canvas and see how they do, even if they were an amateur painter. And I think that you have a different respect.
I agree entirely. And I think in a way, sometimes labeling Churchill as an artist can actually be too professional a term to apply to him, which then makes one instinctively compare with great masters, or Turners, or whoever it may be. And of course, Churchill can't measure up to the likes of a Turner. Yeah. But considering how much else he was achieving in his life, holding almost every great office of state, prime minister twice, 50 plus books, 5 children, it is astonishing, the output and how he was able to develop over time. In terms of people's response to his paintings at Chartwell, it can be quite interesting, because in the studio, which, as I mentioned, we hung last year during lockdown, which was a huge undertaking, and it is transformed. So anyone who's not seen it since before COVID, do go have a look. There can be a slight moment with some people where it's slight sensory overload, because it does seem almost sort of 360 degrees of his paintings. And I think that in order to appreciate him and his works, you need to sort of survey them individually almost, rather than a mass collection in that space. Obviously, the reason we do that is because that's how he hung his paintings. But when you're looking at his paintings, Paul, how is it that you sort of approach a sort of analysis of him and his individual works?
Well, I have two, with any painting. I went to see a Sorolla show at the National Gallery, and I think you'll see any artist at a big museum or show, they tend to be the ones really up close, not getting in the way of everyone, but looking rakingly at the way the canvas, how they put the paint on. And I tend to look at his paintings very close, then I'll stand back. Obviously, you view a painting from a distance. So there's different ways I look at paintings, not only Churchill, whomever paints, if I'm interested in it. But I really do, I see his paintings because I know a lot of the locations and I know how difficult it is to achieve and how large they are. I'm always interested in the way that he achieved it and the choices of colors that I do agree with sometimes with Lady Churchill, where he would overwork some. He would be too garish with his colors, his greens or whatever colors. But he loved it. He rejoiced in these things. And the more I'm around them, the more I see of them, the more grays I see in his paintings, the more subtlety that on first glance, when you look through reproductions, you don't see. And I think if you're lucky enough to live with the painting, and I agree with you, the overload that you have in a sanctum of a studio, rather than it being on a gallery wall with just a few on the wall, I feel that I still feel you see this joy of painting with him. When you go in a room, you just think, wow, he really loved doing this. I think there was a comment of a lady that went to see the Royal Academy show in 1959, and she said he must have wonderful holidays. Or I think it's the joy that you see in his paintings. So, but going back to the critical thing, I think any public figure is overly analyzed, especially Churchill. And like you say, with the books that he wrote, but Andrew Roberts said that there's 1,010 books written on him. So there's so much attention and a spotlight. And with political climates changing like today, everything is analyzed and overanalyzed and opinions fly. And like I say, at auction with these prices, he never intended on his pay. He was doing it for a hobby. So there was none of this intention from his part. But unfortunately, everything is dissected and judged in his life. And I think unfairly so in some cases. But we're looking at these paintings. It's lovely. First and foremost, I was just trying to find the locations, and then I grew to understand a little bit of the painting. And it's all subjective. Everybody will have a different opinion on what they like. Or I was asked by somebody which is my favorite painting, and that's hard too, because there are so many that I think are really well painted. There are a lot of, you know, duds, and every artist has, but I think that he really did some out of the park. I think they're very, very beautiful paintings.
Do you have a favorite, or can you not pick one?
Well, I do have a favorite in that there's an emotional connection. I was lucky enough to go back to Villa Silvia in Cap Ferrat. It's a private estate, and when you go there and I mean, this is the obsession that I had, that I would find this location, and some of them could be the most obscure place and people are wandering around and they have no idea that Winston was there painting, and you found it, and it's been dormant for 55 years that nobody knew where it was. And you don't want to leave. It's you're thinking, okay, this is, it's like you found something and you want to shout and tell everybody. So there's an emotional connection that I have to some of them. I do love the pergola in Villa Silvia. I think that's a beautiful painting. And when you stand there, he nailed it. I mean, it is just, it's the same, because the wisteria is there, the green pillars on the pergola. It's like an unusual stone. I've actually got a piece of it. I get the little piece of the stone. It's very unusual. And it was Harold Petto that designed it. He worked with Edwin Lutyens, and they designed a lot of these beautiful, I think he did 3 in Cap Ferrat. So he was always, even in England, he was around these beautiful old estates, and he would capture the architecture. So there are quite a few paintings that I've seen in life and seen the location. So they tend to be a bit more emotional to me, but that's the wrong reason to like a painting. It's just What about you, working around so many of his paintings? Which ones do you like?
Oh, I've got a few favourites. I think my most favourite is probably for a quite emotional connection as well, which is one of the ones on the main stairs as you come down from the study towards the dining room. Yeah. Painting called Valley of the Eureka, and the majority of the composition is moving water, but there's also a shadow cast across the length of the water as well. And I think for him to have been able to achieve the depiction of colour and motion in the water and the reflection as well as the shadow across it, I just think that he would have been so proud of that one, because there's so many elements at play in it. And for me personally, having lived for quite a few years on site at Chartwell in the top flat, that was a painting I passed every single day by definition on my very small commute to my desk. So that one has a personal connection. But I also really like some of his interiors as well. I think there's depictions of the interiors of Blenheim, for example, I think are really, really interestingly done. And it's not something that makes a big part of his catalogue, the interiors, but I think they're really interesting as well.
I agree.
Because for me, his paintings are essentially a visual diary. That's how I often represent them to people. I say that they're a visual diary, and combined they form this sort of kaleidoscope of colour. I think those two phrases to me sum up his paintings. Yeah. And yeah, for those reasons I really like those. A third I would pick actually is the one you put very last in your book, I think, which is Daybreak at Cassis.
Yes, yes.
Which is an absolutely beautiful one. For anyone going to Chartwell anytime soon, it is the one opposite the lift in the inner hall. So it's one of those ones that, dare I say it, where it's hung risks it not having as much attention as I think it deserves. Was that one that you sought out as well, Paul, the Daybreak at Cassis? It's hard to do.
You can't possibly. There's no. That's the thing. There's some things that it's just a rock, and you're thinking, how am I going to find a red rock and But that one is impossible because it's just a seascape. There's no way. No idea. There's no landmark. And some of them, they just have a hint of a landmark. And I love that. I was saying to you yesterday that I think the challenge of finding some of these. Look, I printed out this. This is, unfortunately, it didn't make my book, and the paintings group has actually retitled this. This was thought to be, it's at Chartwell. It was thought to be at Port Lim and the Pavilion. And this is actually at Chateau Belson in Aix. And I would take these laminated cards. This is me holding it up in front of that. Now, I came here a few times and photographed all the Aix paintings, and I missed this. I didn't. So some of them, even though there's a very distinctive structure that you would think you'd easily spot it, you don't. And I don't know why. All of a sudden, it was I was there, and I thought, oh my God, I recognized that. And then you find it. So when you have this really vague landscape of maybe a rock or nothing, it's almost impossible. But I quite like that challenge. I love that whole puzzle thing. But going back to the one you liked about the water, without sounding patronizing, I don't know if you paint, but that's very perceptive of you to recognize that movement of the water and the shadow. It is very hard to paint something like that. And to recognize that in his work, that's what you should do. I think it's easy to just look and think that, because when you stand in some of these places, they are identical. I mean, there is nothing that he's got wrong with that. His drawing, everything. I mean, there was a massive fire in 1980 and it burnt the whole landscape out. So this greenery just went away. But every time I stand there, it made it easier to find. He didn't really use artistic license. And I'm always surprised at how accurate he was with his drawing and his efforts, the way that he would do them, the way that he would paint. What is the most popular painting among people that visit, do you think?
I think people really like the paintings that have sort of a Churchill element to the narrative of what's being depicted. So I think Bottlescape, yes. Very, very popular one at Chartwell. I think because it's in situ in the dining room and there's an immediate connection to its context where it's displayed, makes people enjoy it. But of course there is, the fact that Churchill enjoyed his Paul Rafferty and his, very, very weak whiskey sodas. And so there's an element of the character of Churchill that you can then see playing out on a canvas. But I think as well, people look at Bottlescape and go, oh, that's so Churchill. But then they look closer and there's a huge amount of skill in depicting not only a sort of symmetrical object, but reflection on a symmetrical object. And he's doing that numerous times across one painting. So I think that people often enjoy it at quite a surface, immediate level, but then perhaps on a second viewing, they can appreciate the technical ability involved as well.
Well, the one I like is the one that he did with Nicholson. There's a flower in a vase. And Nicholson's, I actually love Nicholson's still lifes. I mean, I'm genuinely a huge fan before I knew Churchill painted. But Churchill's effort is, I think, quite comparable. It's a fantastic painting. And those two paintings together are lovely to see as an artist that inspired him and taught him. But I do love his landscapes. I am very much interested in landscape painting myself, but I think it's he really did that well.
I'd be interested to know as well, because you and I have been saying about the fact that his paintings are essentially what he's looking at. It's the views that inspire him in that moment. Yeah. Do you give weight to the theories that bound around Churchill's kind of emotional state and that side of the story of him as an artist? What would you say about that element? You
mean the black dog and things like that? Is that what you're speaking of?
Yes, that sort of thing.
I really feel, again, this is all subjective. I mean, I'm not an historian or academic, and to be honest, I think all of our opinions, to a degree, even the family opinions, I think they're subjective. And there are lots been made of that black dog, and some people feel he had so much weight on his shoulders. I mean, who wouldn't feel that stressed? But I genuinely feel he painted as pure enjoyment. I feel it went beyond that for him, where he was very serious about it, took it very seriously, and really tried to grow, really tried with all his might to be as good as he could be. I don't believe that he had particular messages in his paintings. I don't think many artists, especially Impressionist type painters, had some of them obviously had social injustice or would make statements within their paintings. I don't think Winston did that. I genuinely think he found things attractive and he would paint them. I don't think he had time. In his lifetime, let's just say he did between 500 and 600 paintings. That's not enough. I was saying about him to you the other day about growing. I don't think he painted enough to really become a professional. But I do at least 300 a year, and I've been painting for years, and that's most artists will do a lot of paintings. Whereas Winston didn't have the time to do that. But even within that body of work, I think a lot of it is where he would, like you say, he would go on holiday, and it's almost like a child where he would send them home to Clementine and just ask her to refrain from opening them, because he would almost like Christmas presents, like coming back fishing, and instead of having photographs, or he would have these paintings that everybody could coo over or critique, or and that's lovely. And I think that's mainly what he did it for. I don't think it was to make any social statements or, you know, anything like that. He did some war paintings, didn't he? There was one that he painted and he got in trouble for the locals in Italy, painting some bombed out buildings, and he realized he was being insensitive and moved on. And even there, I don't think he was really making a social statement. I think he was just painting the landscape as it was and what they'd just gone through. But yeah, I don't feel the Black Dog. I just think he had so much on his shoulders, in my opinion. I'm sure maybe he did have extra, you know, bipolar moods. I have no idea, but I don't think painting necessarily, I think he would have found something would have placated him.
I think I'm inclined to agree with you about that. Some elements of, to use that phrase, Black Dog, in my opinion, have been overstated. And I think that Churchill, as an artist, there's a real process of sort of osmosis about the way he's painting at any point in time. It's so subjective to not only where he is and who he's spending time with socially, but which artists he's spending a great deal of time with. So we touched on earlier the fact that the years when he's with Lavery a great deal tend to be the darker ones. So I think that, but perhaps would he have been drawn to recreate Lavery's style if there hadn't been some darkness there? I think that perhaps it is one of those things where it is so subjective. One thing that I'm quite interested in is his Impressionist paintings. And I think it's very easy for us to now see Impressionism as a sort of accepted form of art. And but at the time when Churchill was starting to dip his toe in the water of Impressionism, it was still seen as quite radical and quite rebellious. I think that the National Gallery was only starting to really weave in Impressionist art in, you know, the Edwardian era. So Churchill's only painting a few years after that. And in my mind, the fact that it coincides with Churchill's radical decade, so when he's moved across the Liberals and he's implementing some more radical policies, perhaps there is something to correlate there between a perceived radical form of art in that era and a radical politician. But that's the thing with historians, as I am, we often try and draw these connections, and sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not. So it's very interesting to hear you be much more matter of fact about it, and it's literally just what he's seeing in that moment.
Well, I think, well, Lavery, he was in Cap Ferrat. Yes, I think Lavery was staying Cap Dye in 1921 with Hazel, and I think Winston and Clementine were in Nice. And that's when he went to Villa Silvia, and I think Cap Ferrat, and he did paint there, and it was much lighter. But I think that initial, you know, First World War, 1915, and then the Lavery darker studio work, that was just happenstance. Had he been with, I don't know, in the south of France with Paul Mars, it might have been completely different. So I think it's very easy to make connections, and we all look for connections. We all want to read, interpret something, or put it to bed, put a box on it. I don't know. Maybe it was. Maybe he did feel those things, but I think he jumped around. And again, almost like a child coming with his paint box. We were speaking about him being painted as a young man, or being around art. I think he was around, he said that he didn't have much interest in art really until he started painting, and then he started wanting to go to museums and wanting to go to galleries. And I think he was around refined women, like you say, his mother and Lady Churchill. I think that they really probably were always like that, always appreciated that, and maybe guided him. And then he became obsessed with it. And I think that that's lovely that he found that, and it really channeled it. But it was always a searching thing. In my opinion, I think it's a searching thing. Not so much the subject matter. I think that wasn't. That was where he was, and if he had time and it wasn't raining, if it was raining in the south of France, he would dictate to the secretaries and be writing. But if it was sunny and it was a nice subject. But it is a very difficult, the thing that I have as a painter, it's not a unique view, but I have because I paint outside like he does, an understanding. It's very frustrating. It's not something where you just go along and it's always a pleasurable thing. It's very like him grumbling, that's no good, and scraping it off and getting in a real mood, or you spent 2 or 3 hours on something and it's just awful and you just want to get rid of it. It can be quite frustrating as much as it's rewarding. And during a painting, you go through these emotional curves that you tend to get to a point late on in a painting where it almost becomes the fun element. The very beginning is the fun element because it's free and you're just putting it on, there's no commitment. Then you get to the middle ground where it looks like nothing and you hope nobody's going to come and look over your shoulder because it looks terrible. And then you get to a point where you've actually, it's to you at the time, looks refined and sort of more like the scene in front of you. And that's the fun bit. But you go through this emotional roller coaster. And it's not addictive is the wrong word, but it's a challenge every time. And I think that's what he got hooked on. I think you never win. You get up every day with hope and go to bed, especially if you're looking at Sergeant Monet. You're thinking you just want to break your brushes and think, why do I do this? And I'm sure he did that. I'm sure he's surrounded by these wonderful artists, but something drove him to go on.
Speaking of being driven to go on, just thinking back to your, detective work that you've done to ascertain the locations of these paintings, and I should say that the one that you've identified previously as Port Lim and now Chateau Belson, there are genuine changes to the catalogue. In addition to you being able to replicate where things are visually in a photograph, there are genuinely these new discoveries being made as a result, which is a fantastic thing to have, and we're hugely grateful at Chartwell when you send through any updates so we can just make things as accurate as possible. But I think one thing that's very interesting is that you've included a section at the back of your book of one still to find.
Yes.
And I'm really interested to know what made you make the decision to, at that point, draw the line in the sand there and then.
Well, there's a point, but there's lots, there's way more than that. And I quite like the involvement of other people. This is an ego thing, by the way. This is not my baby. This is something where nobody else is. I can't believe somebody else hasn't found. Many people have helped me. This is not just me finding these things. I've certainly asked local people, and they say, "Oh yeah, that's over there around the corner." I'm like, why did nobody say anything before? But I think that there's and some people understood this that owned the big villas, because I had to wear many different hats. I not only had to find it, then I had to find who lived there if it wasn't a public space. Then I had to try and ingratiate myself and ask, can I come in? And I'm not some weirdo. And this is, they had, some of them had no idea that Churchill was there. And luckily, most of them were all of them were very gracious and allowed me to come in. But I hope I imparted the importance of history, because many of these things will be lost as people die off, as people with knowledge. We're all going to go at some point, but it's lovely. There's so much known about him, the color of his underwear, the silk pink, and there's so much known, and there's so many gaps that I don't know why there's so much written about this. It just happened to be a thing that I looked at and I could see. But I think it would be very sad if they're not compiled as in the catalogue raisonné correctly, as much as can be done. And also these locations are changing. There's some of them that will change forever and will be gone, and that's a sad thing too. So that drove me. That really made me very focused and finding them. But that's been the fun bit. I really love it. It's like Google Earth, old postcards. And sometimes it was an epiphany. For instance, there was one in Villa Silvia in Cap Ferrat. I'd painted myself, and I just kept looking at this painting. It's Prince Rainier owned the house with Grace Kelly. There's a British Pathé film of them walking out of it. And I had no idea of any of this history. And there's a pretty little turret. It's a bay on the west side of Cap Ferrat. And it's this little turret has got a jetty. And I'd painted it with some friends. We were artist friends. And about a year later, I kept looking at this painting, his painting, and I thought, I know this, I recognize this. And all of a sudden it was an epiphany. I knew it was there. So then I realized that he'd stood in that garden, and that's when I really focused on this garden. It has a green roof, and I went on Google Earth and I found the pergola, and then I got in touch with the owners, which were very, very sweet and allowed me to come in. And so it's almost organic, obsession, organic, and a puzzle. But the puzzle is just fascinating. And that's where my children think I've gone too far and obsessed.
And I think one thing that's brilliant about your having undertaken this, Paul, is that with your eye as an artist and your enhanced sort of visual memory as a result, you can come across these scenes and think, hang on, that could be a Churchill painting. Because when looking at the sheer volume of Churchill paintings, I don't think everyone could hold at the forefront of their mind that many paintings. So would you say that that has been an asset to you in this process, the visual memory that you have in order to be able to do that?
Well, I'm older now, so my visual, when you play, you know, the memory game you play as a child or with children, you know, turn a card over, and you try to match them. It's like that. You've seen it somewhere. You think, okay, where in the pack is it? And you were gracious enough to allow me to come into Chartwell and look through the archive. So there are many things that I'm looking through that you piece it together. It's either not titled, or you know who that person is or where it is. And that one piece of information doesn't mean anything on its own, but it does when you combine it with 2 or 3 other pieces. And it might not do anything. It certainly doesn't necessarily find a location. It just, it puts it to bed. It puts something, and may help somebody else as an academic later on figure these things out. They might be interested in that particular element of his work. And I think from that perspective, it has helped me, because I can see things and it connects. For instance, in Chartwell on the ground, because again, you allowed me to take so many wonderful pictures for my book in the studio. There's one of his easels on the floor. It's a metal one. And I know, because I've got so many easels myself, I'm obsessed with the materials. I know that's the metal one that he used in Madeira, and I've never seen him use that one before. I know all the different easels he had. And that's lovely that that's folded up and it's there, and he only used it once on that painting. I haven't seen any other images of him using that. And another element is finding the ones that are missing. Like this photograph here is in Torcello. It's his detective standing behind him, and he's painting La Conda Cipriani. It's a restaurant, a famous restaurant. It's where Hemingway stayed for many years. I think the Queen's visited. That painting's missing, but it's clear enough to see that you know and obviously it's him painting it. That's fascinating to me too, that there are paintings out there that may come to light one day, or not. Maybe they're gone, I don't know. But they're all puzzles, so you remember that, and it's in the back of your mind, and it may not come up, but it may, and then you have a little piece of information. There's a very famous painting on a photograph of him painting on the River Soar, and that painting's missing. And another one in Miami. I was speaking to Katherine Churchill the other day. I'm surprised that we haven't noticed that the painting that he was so photographed in Miami in the surf club, it's now the Four Seasons in Miami, that painting's missing. And it doesn't have a C number that designates it as such. There are things that can be very apparent. We all see and we know, but we don't connect, or we don't look at it and think, hold on a minute, that painting is missing. So yes, but that's where the obsession comes. That's where maybe it's too much. I don't know. I need to paint myself and my next show going. What about you? I mean, you as a historian and working in Chartwell, do you start to put these things in a part of your brain?
So I'm someone who works in a very sort of numerical, date-driven way in terms of my study of history. So I end up sort of compartmentalizing it much more. So for me, it's different eras. What book was he writing at that point in time? Which political office did he hold at that point in time? So that's kind of how my memory works, and where I associate it. I end up instantly connecting things to his wider career. Mm-hmm. So probably more so than that instinctive kind of visual.
Yes. Mine's easy though. Yours is very broad. I mean, there's so much with the house, with his works, but all across the board. That must be daunting.
Well, there's 8 years worth that's accumulated up here. So, but as you say, I'm very lucky. I'm completely immersed in it, and I get to work with this phenomenal collection day in, day out. So I feel very, very lucky to.
How is this? Is the studio open yet? Is it able to visit?
Yes, we were able to open for about 6 weeks last year before Kent sadly entered Tier 3 and everything closed again. But most recently we reopened on May the 17th. And there is social distancing still in place, so we're not able to take the numbers in the house and studio that we can normally. We're hoping social distancing lifts soon, but in the meantime our visitors are by and large very understanding, and yes, enjoying the spaces enormously and enjoying being back at Chartwell.
And very simply, how did you take it back to the way it was more in his day? What changes did you make? So we didn't aim to do a like by like recreation, because we simply don't have
100% of the paintings that were there during Churchill's lifetime. So that was never the aim. It was more a very general recreation of the look and feel, I would say. So when the studio opened in 1968, it did so with far fewer paintings on the walls, and as a result a lot of the infrastructure had been removed. As paintings came back to us as the years went by, some infrastructure was reinstalled, but it was all painted white, and so the colours of the paintings against all this white didn't quite look as it had in Churchill's time, because he had this sort of exposed oak shelving which had almost a frame effect. So we took all the paintings down, stripped all that sort of extra paint off the shelves, reinstated some of the shelving that had been removed since, and then recreated a hang broadly like his, but we also made some curatorial tweaks whereby we brought arguably the sort of most important paintings to the story of him as an artist down to easier sight levels. Wonderful. So, you know, and we have one shelf where if you go right to left across one shelf, you get a sort of potted history of Churchill as an artist. Because we have to be mindful as well, we have people for a limited period of time in that space. So they might not necessarily have time to gaze upon everything, but perhaps if you go in and have a look across that one shelf, you can see different influences, different mentors, different styles, and we've got the first and the last paintings in our collection on that one row as well. So so it wasn't a like-for-like recreation, but it does look much more like it did in his day.
Munnings made a comment when he came from the Royal Academy, he was the president at the time, to choose paintings for the show that they were going to put on. And he said that there were no little daubers, there were just attack, huge canvases that he would have lying around the room. Do you know, is it known where he would use, for instance, the magic lantern? Was he still working in the dining room at the time or when he used that, or did he use it in the studio? Do you know?
I'm trying to think. So it's so the drawing room was the space that doubled as when the studio ceased being the studio. The studio for a time became largely storage, and he sort of relocated the house for a time in the drawing room to paint. But the magic lantern, a lot of those paintings were earlier than that, so that would have been the studio itself in those sort of interwar years. But then again, he was still using the magic lantern after the war. So there's the recreation of the photograph of Lady Churchill that hangs in our sitting room, which is a 50s painting using the magic lantern. So that might well have been in the drawing room at that point. So it's probably a roving bit of kit that went with him wherever he painted in the house.
Yeah. Well, he had a smaller one. I think the first one he got, it was Sickert's influence, where he would grid up. There were two different distinct techniques that Sickert would use to transpose. I think even Hockney tried for a period of time doing that. There are different ways of getting the image on the canvas. It's not cheating really, because it's just a way of starting off. You still got to paint the thing. But there was this large one, I think, that you have at Chartwell that's more of almost a theatre light that he would project onto the canvases in color. And then I know Sergeant Murray had one that was a Pullman or something. It was a smaller, looks like a 50s or 60s later one, that he would use small slides. And I think for trips that he would make, not only the Lady Churchill photograph, but there were trips that he would make that he either couldn't finish a painting or wanted to start something, that he would use those images. Again, I think a time was a real constraint with him. He couldn't, I mean, there were periods, especially towards the end in the 50s when he was at La Posa, he would have very, very long periods there. He could indulge in painting. But certainly earlier on, I think in the 20s and 30s, he painted his biggest output. I'm sure it was like a time constraint, and the weather is a little bit more similar here. But if he were to go back, I think it would be very difficult for him. And I think that's why he would take them back, and that's why they would be worked. And along with the Churchill heritage, we go over paintings that actually look, during the course of the book, I actually thought it was two different paintings. There was one photograph that we found that had L'Or Marin in Provence, and I thought it was a different painting. It was just a different stage of the painting, and he had worked on it more, and maybe he'd done it back in the studio, not with the magic lantern, maybe with some photographs that you've got many of the in the archive at Chartwell, that he would use to finish off the painting, even if it was a black and white photograph, that he could finish it. And I find all that interesting. How did he do it, or how did he find the time, or and this again all goes back to the learning process of learning something from Sickert or Lavery or Paul Mars, and then applying it and taking the best from everybody. It wasn't just he was a one-trick pony. He genuinely would take from everybody. I wonder if he did this in politics in much of his life. He was very astute at, even surrounding himself by able people. And I think that's a good thing. You learn much better from that way, rather than trying to muddle through on your own.
Well, I think on that note, we might have to start to round up, Paul, because I think we are going to have a question and answer opportunity available to our viewers today. But one final thought, I wonder if we could finish on. For a long time, Churchill's paintings were seen through the prism of this great man of history, wartime leader, elder statesman, and it's interesting that he painted, and look at the pretty scenes he painted, and look at the lovely holidays he must have had, as you said earlier. And there is increasingly a shift to look at actually his technical ability and how the sorts of things he was painting and the way he was painting changed over time. Mm. If you were to speak to someone who came in with that perspective of, oh, he's a wartime leader who painted, that's nice, and wanted to sort of convert them to understand how much painting meant to him, what would you say?
Look at his paintings. If you look at the body of work, really look at them, and not just a cursory look, but maybe go to some of the locations with this book or David and Minnie's book. Go through the paintings that go to Hever Castle and look at them, Trent Park, wherever is public. Chartwell. It's wonderful to see them and then see these paintings and how hard it is. I mean, and almost have a little sketchbook, even if it's watercolor, have a go and see what you do. And I think you appreciate them differently. And the more you live with something, the more you study something, and not just a cursory look through the studio, but go up to the paintings, look at them. I think that really conveys a lot. And if you look at other leaders that do paint, I think he's one of the best, or the best, of politicians, prime ministers, presidents. He's way up there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. That's brilliant to talk through not only Churchill as an artist, but the discoveries that you undertook as well. And I would strongly recommend anyone who hasn't got their hands on a copy of Paul's book.
Can I just say one thing? There was an old lady I met. She was 94. She was at Restaurant Philippe in Fontaine de Vaucluse. And she owned the restaurant, her and her husband. She remembers him coming. And I would ask questions of her. She was a lovely old lady, as sharp as a tack. And I asked, what did he eat? And she said he was a gourmand. He would eat anything, but he loved the trout. And that's a rare thing, to actually see somebody or meet somebody that's still alive that remembers him painting there. And that was a great day, that one.